Good morning to our audience in the United States. Good afternoon to those of you in Europe, and to the many who are joining us from India, Pakistan, and points further east. Good evening. It is a privilege and pleasure to welcome you all to this symposium hosted jointly by the University of Virginia Institute for Humanities and Global Cultures and the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. I am very pleased to welcome also a distinguished panel of scholars, and particularly Professor Neeti Nair, whose idea this event was, and who has done all of the work in assembling those who are speaking to us today. I will leave further introductions to her. Recordings of today's events will be available in the next few days on the RSAA YouTube channel and via the RSAA website. Articles based on the talks given today will in due course be published in a special edition of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs journal, Asian Affairs, which is available both in print and in downloadable form. And we will let you know when that becomes available. On a practical point, today's symposium is in two parts with a short break between them. The same Zoom login can be used for both parts. Thank you for joining us. And I will now hand over to Neeti Nair.
Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Neeti Nair, Associate Professor of History here at the University of Virginia. I teach modern South Asian history, and my research has centered on Hindu politics in colonial Punjab, nationalism, the partition of India, and censorship in post-colonial South Asia. I appreciate your taking the time to join us for this symposium on citizenship, belonging, and the partition of India. I'd like to thank the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, the Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures, the Office of the Vice President for Research, and the College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Virginia for their support in bringing us together today. Michael Ryder and Bijan Omrani at the Royal Society, Debjani Ganguly, Bruce Holsinger, and Claudrina Harold at the university have been enthusiastic and supportive. Special thanks to my colleague in the Department of Religious Studies, Sonam Kachru, for moderating the second session. And thanks to Michael Ryder, Anne Gilliam, and Joseph Way for their help with technical assistance. On the 9th of December 2019, the Lok Sabha, or the lower house of India's parliament, passed the Citizenship Amendment Bill, making it easier for religious minorities, specifically enumerated as Hindus, Sikhs, Christians, Parsis, Jains, and Buddhists, in the three neighboring states of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, to acquire Indian citizenship. An amendment proposed by opposition parties to replace these listed religious minorities with the omnibus label persecuted minorities was rejected. Amendments proposing that neighboring Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Nepal also be included were rejected. The bill faced fierce resistance within Parliament for introducing religion as a category of citizenship. It was charged as being unconstitutional. Today, the Citizenship Amendment Act awaits its final verdict at the hands of the Supreme Court of India. In the weeks and months that followed December 9th, 2019, citizens across India, led in several instances by Muslims, chanted the preamble to the Constitution, narrated episodes of Muslim sacrifice in the course of India's independence, held open-air meetings and public seminars on secularism, opened libraries and reading rooms at protest sites, affirmed the place of Muslims in India, and declared the Constitution Amendment Act unconstitutional. The atmosphere was electric. Across India, police forces picked up citizens, detained them, and then dropped them off outside the state's borders, forcing them to find their own way back home or back to their sites of protest. The protests appeared spontaneous and were organized by a multitude of civil society organizations, but not led or supported by any opposition party. The protests marked a new moment in the technique of mass non-violent participation spearheaded by Mahatma Gandhi and now led by the women of Shaheen Bagh, a protest site in Delhi. It has become fashionable for everyone masquerading as a historian these days to produce documents to bolster their version of the past. We saw this trend once more during the day-long Lok Sabha debate on the Citizenship Amendment Bill. But history is not a matter of pop quizzes or about producing rival bits of evidence to score a debating point, of turning on a magic tap of data or election manifestos to produce a quick fix solution to historical grievances. History entails a deeper consideration of what counts as evidence, of making sense of loose ends that do not fit into any easy telos, that complicate a fairy tale narrative with one hero and one villain, of good Muslim and bad Muslim, of good nationalism and bad nationalism. What happens when we foreground the voice of the refugee, the border crosser, the linguistic and religious minority within the territorial borders of India? The frequent recourse to particular interpretations of historical events, of partition, of the War of 1971, and more recently, the abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir during the day-long CAB debate on December 9th, 2019, made one thing exceedingly clear. The particular interpretations of the past haunts our most important decisions for the future. But in the immortal words of the poet Agha Shahid Ali, my memory keeps getting in the way of your history. As historians, anthropologists, poets, writers, it behooves us to participate in this exchange, to offer a longer and richer perspective rather than the cherry picking of facts and documents to advance a particular narrative. We present these papers in the backdrop of the CAA, keenly aware that our task is not only to make sense of the present, but also to owe fidelity to the stories of the past, their truths as well as their burdens. Perhaps in this endeavor, we will also be able to offer a different vision of a future. Let me now introduce our panelists for the first session. Our first speaker, Antara Datta, is lecturer in international relations at Royal Holloway College in the University of London. Her first book, Refugees and Borders in South Asia, The Great Exodus of 1971, uses the War of 1971 to examine the creation of affective and effective borders in South Asia. Today, she will speak on refugee flows from Bangladesh and the citizenship question in Assam. Our next speaker, Farhana Ibrahim, is professor of sociology at the Indian Institute of Technology in New Delhi. She's the author of Settlers, Saints, and Sovereigns, an ethnography of state formation in Western India. Today, she will draw from her second book titled From Family to Police Force, Security and Belonging on a South Asian Border, forthcoming with Cornell University Press, to explain how refugee flows on the Gujarat-Kutch border with Pakistan were affected by the War of 1971. Our third panelist, Sarah Waheed, is Assistant Professor of History at Davidson College in North Carolina. She is the author of Hidden Histories of Pakistan, Censorship, Literature, and Secular Nationalism in Late Colonial India, forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. Sarah will situate the current politics of Asaduddin Owaisi, president of the All India Majlis-e-Ittehadul Muslimin, and his opposition to the Citizenship Amendment Act, against a longer history of belonging and the politics of citizenship in the former princely state of Hyderabad. Our fourth and final panelist, Arsalan Khan, is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Union College in New York State. His paper today on Pakistani state sovereignty and the rising force of blasphemy politics draws on his extensive fieldwork with the Tablighi Jamaat in Pakistan. To the preconceived notions of Indian parliamentarians and sunrise scholars debating the CAB on the nature of Pakistan as an Islamic state and whether or not Muslims face persecution within Pakistan, Arsalan's paper offers much to think with. Listen well. You will find the Q&A feature in the bottom toolbar. Please type in your questions and do identify to whom you are addressing them. Let's begin. Antara Datta.
Thanks, Neeti. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you for organizing this. Today, I want to talk about questions of citizenship and belonging, which in Assam has a history that dates back to the colonial period. And many Assamese politicians have argued that the state bears a particularly unique burden of migration that marks it out from the rest of India. So in tracing this history, I want to focus on a particular moment of rupture in these citizenship narratives in Assam that I will argue has not received perhaps enough scholarly or legal attention, that moment of 1971. The date 24th, 25th March 1971, the night on which Operation Searchlight was carried out in Dhaka by the Pakistani army, finds itself present in a number of the legal and constitutional measures that apply both to India as a whole, but to Assam in particular. But this date is often seen as an incidental marker. In this paper, I will reintroduce this date as a significant moment that helps us to locate the events of 1971 within a broader history of migration and citizenship in India that culminates in the controversy around the National Register of Citizens in particular, and then the Citizenship Amendment Act. In doing so, I want to highlight both the continuities in Assam about anxieties about the outsider, but also moments of rupture in 1971 when questions of belonging on the basis of both language and religion emerge. So in order to understand the logic behind the panoply of measures deployed by the central government, I also want to contribute theoretically into how we understand citizenship. Using Anupama Roy's schema of encompassment and closure, I will argue that, for instance, while the Indira Mujib Accord of 1972, which uses that date of 25th March 1971 as a moment of legal closure, and it is then written into various other acts, such as the IMDT Act of 1983, which Anupama Roy sees as a moment of encompassment, broadening the definition of citizenship. I want to look at 1971 in Assam as a moment that marks affective closure in ways that transcend Roy's understanding of such legislation. So in fact, I want to look at more popular understandings of what it means to belong in Assam, deploying Joya Chatterjee's claims that simply studying legislative practices as a top-down process of citizenship obscures the ways in which claim making is a multifaceted process and involves popular resistance to state interventions and state responses to such popular and populist sentiments. So in doing so, I find that this moment of 1971, this moment of affective closure in 1971 has a dual role to play. First, the Hindu refugee emerges as a source of threat, mimicking some of the discourse around Hindu refugees who moved to West Bengal after 1947. And there is excellent work on that. Joya Chatterjee herself, Uditi Sen, Hoymonti Roy. So I don't want to go over that ground. But in Assam, the question of language produces particular anxieties around the figure of the Bengali Hindu refugee. Second, and more critically, the Muslim refugee too emerges as a figure to be distrusted. And 1971, I will argue, marks the moment in which the narrative of infiltration as applied to the Muslim border crosser takes hold. At the same time, by using the date of 24th March 1971 as a line in the sand, we are reminded that 1971 does not just create new territorial boundaries in South Asia, but it also gives rise to new ideas of belonging based on such territoriality. So I will finish by arguing that the National Register of Citizens, which is revived by the BJP government, is a response to this growing narrative, which begins in 1971, about the Muslim infiltrator from Bangladesh. But this narrative comes unstuck somewhat when the NRC ends up producing a long list of Bengali Hindu refugees or migrants whom it terms as illegal migrants. So we are once again thrown back into the duality of anxieties of 1971, where the Hindu and the Muslim refugee were seen to be feared, but for slightly different reasons. So in response to this, the government of India then introduces the Citizenship Amendment Bill of 2016, which would allay some of those anxieties and mark the Muslim border crosser as the one who did not belong to the Indian nation state. But because this legislation obscures those demarcations of linguistic difference highlighted by 1971 and only partially answers the Assamese question, both the NRC and the CAB meet with opposition in Assam. So very briefly, I want to talk about Assam's contentious history with regard to migration. By the middle of the 19th century, it became apparent that large-scale tea cultivation was possible in Assam. And in the late 19th century, the presence of oil in the region was first detected. So colonial officials actively encouraged immigrant laborers. Two distinct categories of migrants came in large numbers: workers for Assam's tea plantations from present-day Bihar and Orissa, and peasants from eastern Bengal. Shonjib Borua has written extensively about the ways in which these Bengali migrants sought to assimilate into Assamese society. And he argues that they developed this community who are now described as the Na Assamese or the New Assamese, who were originally Bengali Muslims, but who through a process of integration now spoke Assamese as their native language. Thus, many of those who would have otherwise been marked out as foreigners had moved towards assimilation by sending their children to Assamese medium schools, recording Assamese as their mother tongue in the census. So interestingly, this meant that Muslim migrants found themselves to be quite closely integrated with their Assamese counterparts, much more so than Bengali Hindus, who of course spoke Bengali and were not as keen to adopt the local language. I want to jump forward in terms of the chronological narrative a little bit, and I will do that in this paper a few times, to 1947 and to the post-partition period, where Assam was quite reluctant to take on new refugees. The Chief Minister of Assam, Gopinath Bordoloi, was willing to take on whatever punitive measures Nehru had in place for him, financial measures mainly, for not taking on these refugees. And he made it clear that he was only willing to take in the bare minimum, and he did not mind being regarded as parochial for it. But a second source of discontent during the partition period was the fate of Sylhet. Sylhet had a Muslim majority, but also a substantial Bengali Hindu minority that had frequently migrated to Assam and was a formidable presence in the economic life of the state. A referendum was conducted to determine the future of Sylhet, and it has been argued by Anindita Dasgupta that the joining of Sylhet to East Pakistan on the 6th of July 1947 was met with enormous joy by the Assamese press and the Assam Congress, who saw it as a God-sent opportunity to create a homogeneous province by getting rid of Bengali Muslims as well as Bengali Hindus. But the referendum did not stop the influx of Sylheti refugees into Assam. In fact, it exacerbated it. The continued presence of the Sylheti Bengali Bhadralok was another source of Assamese resentment about the manner in which the process of dealing with partition refugees had left them at a disadvantage. I do once again want to jump forward in terms of the chronology to the night of the 24th of March, 1971, when in the aftermath of Operation Searchlight in Dhaka, and particularly what happened on the campus of Dhaka University, refugees began to pour across the border into India. Now, these were largely, particularly in the first few waves of migration, largely Bengali Hindu refugees. And as the refugee numbers began to become quite overwhelming, the question of who these refugees were and what was going to be done with them became quite paramount. So the state government of Assam declared that these new arrivals were not real refugees like the refugees of 1947. And so in contrast to those real refugees, they could not and would not be allowed to stay beyond the duration of this crisis. And Indira Gandhi, as Prime Minister, and her Minister for Rehabilitation, R.K. Khadilkar, was also keen to sell this particular line of argument to the Assamese, that this was a temporary crisis, but very few believed them. In Rangpur district, as refugees came streaming down the Brahmaputra in makeshift boats, a hostile local population stood by the banks, apprehensive that the new arrivals would push up the prices of daily commodities. And the Assamese argued that these refugees would not only have to be sent back, but if they could not be sent back, they must be sent to other states. And it is here that the seeking of shelter with friends and relatives by many Bengali Hindus was a cause of particular resentment in Assam, because it circumvented the official process of counting how many refugees there were, which was of course critical to eventually sending them back. In late June, R.K. Khadilkar admitted that refugees who had been registered under the Foreigners Act of 1946 would be given a permit and would not be allowed to move from where they were registered. In Meghalaya and Assam, he had left this to the local government, to the state government. But several months later, in August 1971, Khadilkar was forced to admit that the move had backfired. A number of refugees in Assam had not registered themselves. They were living with friends and family that essentially disappeared into the local population, and this was causing widespread resentment. So if we understand the border to be not just a series of posts or a fence on a geographical landscape, but a dividing line that separates people, then it is clear that the sheer scale of the influx of 1971 was creating an affective border between the people of the Northeast and these refugees from East Pakistan. And the result was that the refugees often felt besieged within the camps. They were the victims of harassment and corruption. And the local population, the Assamese, felt that they were bearing a huge political and social burden for a cause that they did not identify with. An incident at a railway station in Lamding highlighted these tensions, but also demonstrated the ways in which earlier anxieties about Bengali Hindu refugees in Assam had been quickly overtaken by fears over Muslim refugees entering the state. On the 27th of April 1971, at Lamding railway station, a group of youth posing as volunteers for the Bangladesh movement assaulted passengers on the 20 down local passenger. They demanded that refugees be accommodated on the train, and when their request was refused, they dragged those inside the compartment out onto the platform, assaulted them, threw their luggage out, and so on and so forth. The assault sparked protests and communal tensions in Guwahati. The press coverage of the incident initially assumed regionalist overtones, with accusations that it was Bengali youth who were creating trouble in the guise of supporting the cause of Bangladesh. Quickly, however, the question of blame shifted, and the linguistic affiliation of the youth involved was overtaken by concerns about whether these were in fact Bengali Muslims who had been sent to this border area to destabilize it. And you see this shift in the way in which the Jansangh in Guwahati responds to this incident. The Jansangh attributed this to, and I quote, the presence of Pakistani agents, fifth columnists, infiltrators, and saboteurs. Bipin Lal Das, a Rajya Sabha member from Assam, was using similar language. He refers to nearly 5 lakh saboteurs amongst the refugees in Assam. So he's not referring to all of the refugees, but to some of the refugees, in particular the Muslim refugees. So now we have concern not only about the presence of their refugees and their growing numbers, but their communal composition as well. And this marks a clear break from the earlier solidarity displayed between the Na Assamia and the Assamese Hindus against Bengali migrants to one where the Muslim refugee was now under suspicion, even though there was no actual evidence that they were involved in the events at Lamding. In Assam, the post-partition refugees had been almost entirely Hindu. So the ongoing resentment about their presence in this period had been a linguistic one, but it is after 1971 that the figure of the illegal infiltrator, being a Muslim border crosser, rears its head. Now, Wazira Zamindar has shown what happened when in the post-partition period, Muslim migrants came back into India, and she's looked at the ways in which, through a number of bureaucratic means, the Indian state sought to exclude these Muslim returnees from either claiming property or even claiming citizenship. But in 1971, we have the next substantial migration of Muslims into India. It is believed that up to 2 million of those who crossed the border, and there were roughly, as I said, 10 million in total, up to 2 million of those who crossed the border were Muslim. And it sparked fears that Assamese Hindus were about to be swamped both linguistically and in ethno-religious terms. So at a moment when the Bengali question could not be easily raised by the Assamese, given widespread solidarity in India with a cause in East Pakistan that was predicated on the question of linguistic nationalism, highlighting the religious affiliation of these border crossers provided a way for the Assamese people to make a local argument about immigration into a national one about security. And so you see this transition from a local argument to a national argument, then being reflected in the legal and constitutional measures that followed this moment of affective closure in 1971. So I once again want to jump forward in terms of the narrative to 1983, where the first of these measures, the IMDT Act, the Illegal Migrants Determination of Tribunal Act, uses that date of 24th March 1971 as a cutoff point. But we also see that in the Assam Accord of 1985, which is signed at the end of the Assam agitation, and the clauses of the Assam Accord are then included in the amendment to the Citizenship Act, which is introduced in 1986. And this amendment introduces a form of graded citizenship that applies to Assam only. and introduces another date, that of 1st January 1966. So if you migrated to India between 1st January 1966 and 25th March 1971, then you would be considered an Indian citizen, but you would be disenfranchised for 10 years. So you wouldn't have the right to vote for 10 years. And so for a moment, we need to pause and think about that date of 25th March 1971 and why it's significant. Because this date marks a moment in time when Bangladesh as a nation did not exist. Bangladesh only achieves independence on the 16th of December 1971, many months later. So the argument behind these moments of legal closure are that the refugees of 1971 were essentially illegal. They were temporary, and anyone who moved to India after the Pakistani army's crackdown on the 25th of March 1971 was essentially doing so illegally. And as we know that many did not go back, and many then re-entered, particularly after the assassination of Sheikh Mujib in 1975. And of course, we must remember that the vast majority of these migrants were Hindu. So even before Bangladesh exists as a territorial nation, its putative citizens were being marked out as illegal infiltrators through legislation that read backwards into this moment, a line in the sand about who could belong and who could not. Once again, I want to jump forward in the narrative a little bit to 2014, when the BJP, after coming to power in the center, puts a great deal of money into updating the National Register of Citizens in Assam. This process had been ongoing through a writ petition filed in the Supreme Court the year before. Now, the NRC as a process had, of course, begun in 1951, but it had never been fully completed. But now it was the completion of it was done with some urgency. The first draft, there were two final drafts. The first final draft excluded 40 lakh people, so 4 million. And the second final draft in 2019 excluded 20 lakh people, so just under 2 million people. And these drafts were accompanied by a particular kind of rhetoric emerging from the Hindu right. So the BJP MLA from Telangana, R. Raja Singh Lodh, said, and I quote, that if these people, illegal Bangladeshis and Rohingya, don't go back with sharafat, then there is a need to make them understand in their own language. They should be shot. Only then will India be safe. He said that when India supported Bangladesh in 1971, 40 lakh people infiltrated into Assam and stayed illegally. He's using exactly the same language as Bipin Lal Dash did in 1971. He's talking about those Muslim refugees. So the specter of 1971 had once again reared its head in the manner in which various parties with a stake in this debate responded to the NRC. For the people of Assam, the NRC was a vindication of the Assam Accord that sought to reify the line of 1971 to mark out who belonged and who didn't. For Bengali Hindus in the BJP that relied on the support of these Bengali Hindus in the state elections in Assam, they had hoped that the list would demonstrate the problem of illegality across the eastern frontier by highlighting a number of illegal Muslims. And so the final list therefore caused consternation. So in response to the widespread dissatisfaction of the Bengali Hindu voter base in Assam and the possible repercussions in neighboring West Bengal as well, the BJP government, which had the Citizenship Amendment Bill of 2016 in its back pocket, began to push it through the legislative process. And as Neeti has already told you, through this act, persons belonging to 6 persecuted faiths, that did not include Islam, from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh could become citizens after 6 years of residence, as opposed to the usual period of 12 years. And this was a part of the BJP's promise to include Hindu refugees and to create an official binary signed into law to move the affective closure of 1971 into an effective legislative border that would mark the Hindu refugee from the Muslim infiltrator. The BJP was conscious of the Bengali Hindu presence in Assam and their response to the 2 iterations of the NRC. So for instance, there was a march led by the Matuas, a community from Bangladesh who protested the first version of the NRC, and they argued that the BJP had promised to look after Bengali Hindu refugees and they had let them down. And this is why the BJP then sought to simultaneously introduce the Citizenship Amendment Bill, because this would provide for a form of belonging that could be exclusively accessed by non-Muslims. So in order to finish, I want to say that here too, there was an echo of 1971. Just as in 1971, the refugees had been greeted with much greater warmth by the nation at large. India was very proud of the way in which it had responded in humanitarian terms to this refugee crisis. Then they had been in the border areas where there was a great deal of resentment. Turning this on its head, the NRC was then received with much greater enthusiasm in these border areas in Assam, which saw this as a solution to the problem generated by 1971, but in fact caused much greater consternation in India as a whole, because of course there was a suggestion that the NRC would be extended to the rest of India. So when the Citizenship Amendment Bill of 2016 is put forth, possibly as a moment of encompassment, to ameliorate what was seen as the excesses of the NRC, the response from Assam mirrors the one of 1971. It is seen as a betrayal of the Assam Accord because it would lead to many Bengali Hindus becoming legal residents in Assam. For the BJP, the category of outsider created by the NRC and CAA was firmly the Muslim. For Assam, the category of outsider, the Bohiragato, was defined both linguistically and religiously as it had been in 1971. And so to end, the BJP's decision to let the Citizenship Amendment Act not go through the entire legislative process, and there are a multitude of reasons for it, but one of the reasons for it is a reflection of their inability to solve this contradiction of religiously and linguistically informed belonging that had emerged during the War of 1971 and the refugee process generated by it. Thank you very much for that, and I'll hand it back to Neeti.